Hi, thanks for watching BibleMountain.com. In this video, we're going to study Job 27 and 28 and learn how to find wisdom. Job 27 and 28 reminds us that we can't go out and dig wisdom out of the ground the way we can dig gold and silver and precious stones out of the ground. And so for us, that raises the question, how do we find wisdom? Where do we get wisdom? What we're going to learn in this video is that wisdom comes from fear. Now let's review Job's story before we get into today's passage. At the beginning of Job's story, Job was blameless and upright, and he was very wealthy. And then there was a dialogue in heaven between Yahweh and Satan, and Yahweh bragged about Job and pointed out how Job was very blameless and upright. Satan said that the only reason Job was blameless and followed God is because Job was wealthy. Satan said that if Yahweh would take away all of Job's possessions, then Job would curse God. So Yahweh gave Satan permission to test Job. So Satan went out and Satan destroyed all of Job's possessions. He killed Job's children, and he afflicted Job with boils from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. Well, Job stayed loyal to God. Job did not curse God. Then there was then three friends named Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar went to visit Job and encourage him and comfort him because they had heard that he was suffering. And there was a long dialogue between these four men. Job spoke first, then Eliphaz, then Job, then Bildad, then Job, then Zophar, and that pattern kept continuing. Throughout this dialogue, the three friends insisted that Job was suffering because he had sinned. Their rationale was basically they believed that God was fair, and since Job was suffering, and since God would not make people suffer unless they deserved it, then the fact that Job was suffering meant that Job must have done something to deserve the suffering, which means he must have sinned. However, Job kept insisting he was innocent. Job insisted that the reason he was suffering is because God was against him. God had turned against him for some reason. So this dialogue continued. They get out to here, and by this time they have not resolved it. And there was a speech here where Job basically said that they were going to have to agree to disagree. And Job pointed out that someday all of them would die, and then God would set them straight, and God would tell them who was right and who was wrong. And so that brings us to today's passage, which is represented by this block here, where Job starts talking about wisdom and where we get wisdom. Now, before we get into today's passage, let me review something about inspiration and inerrancy. Inspiration and inerrancy apply to the author of the book. Job was not the author of the book of Job. Job was the main character of the book of Job. And the author of Job is merely telling us what Job said. The author is not necessarily telling us that we should agree with what Job said. So as we go through today's passage and read what Job said about wisdom, we have to keep in mind that Job was not necessarily correct, and later on we'll ask that question to determine whether or not Job was right or wrong. Now, with all of that, let's get started with Job 27, verse 1. Then Job continued his discourse and said, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has embittered my soul." Now, notice there's a comma here at the end. That tells us that this thought will continue into verse 3. Notice the phrase, "as God lives." Basically here, Job is saying that what he's going to say in verse 3 is every bit as true as the fact that God lives. Notice the word who. That word occurs twice. The word who refers to God. And so Job said, God has taken away my right. God has embittered my soul. Now let's think about the word right. This is a legal term. For example, if there's a trial and someone is declared innocent, then they are declared right. That's the concept of this word here. And so Job believed, as I mentioned earlier, Job believed he was innocent, that he had not done anything, he had not sinned to deserve the calamity that he was suffering. And again, Job believed that God was against him for some reason, had turned against him and was making him suffering. And so Job basically said that God's the one that he's taken away his right, even though Job was innocent. God took away that innocence and was making Job suffer unfairly. Notice also the word embittered. That tells us that Job was a little bit bitter about everything that had happened to him. Verse 3. And remember, Job had said, "As God lives, for as long as life is in me and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips certainly will not speak unjustly, nor will my tongue mutter deceit." Now, this is Hebrew poetry. Hebrew poetry is a little bit different than English poetry. English poetry is about rhyme. Hebrew poetry is about repetition, addition, and contrast. In repetition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the same thing in a different way. In addition, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then adds something to it. And in contrast, a Hebrew poet makes a statement and then says the opposite. Now here, verse 3 is an example of repetition. Notice this first phrase, "For as long as life is in me." Job basically said, "as long as I live." And then this second phrase says the same thing, just in a different way. "And the breath of God is in my nostrils." That's a different way of saying, "as long as I live." So that's verse 3. Verse 4 is also an example of repetition. "My lips certainly will not speak unjustly." So Job said he's not going to say anything wrong. "Nor will my tongue mutter deceit." Here he's basically saying the same thing. So these two different lines say the same thing. And in these two verses, Job basically says, "as long as I live, I will not say anything wrong." Verse 5. "Far be it from me that I should declare you right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me." Now notice here Job's refusal. Again, throughout this dialogue, Job's friends had tried to convince Job that he was suffering because he had sinned. Here, Job flat out said that he was not going to agree with them and declare that they were right about him. Now let's look at verse 6. And remember this is Job speaking to his friends, "I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go. My heart does not reproach any of my days." Now this is an example of addition. Job made this statement in the first sentence, "I hold fast my righteousness and will not let it go," which is very similar to what he had said in the previous sentence, this idea that he believed he was innocent and he was not going to let go of the belief that he was innocent. But then here he adds to that thought by saying that his heart does not reproach any of his days. Let's look at the word heart. Basically, Job said that his heart, his conscience, as he looked back on the days of his life, his heart or his conscience did not reproach him for anything that he had done. And so again, he was going to hold fast to his integrity. He was not going to tell his friends they were right because his heart, his conscience, was not reproaching him for any of his days. Verse 7. "May my enemy be as the wicked, and my opponent as the unjust." Now, when we read this, it's tempting to think that Job's going to start talking about his enemy. That is not correct. What he's actually going to talk about in the following verses is wicked people and unjust people. The reason he brings up his enemy is that Job was so confident about what he was about to say in the following verses that he was willing to wish that his enemy would be as the wicked. Now, I know you may be thinking, well, Jesus said, "love your enemies." That's not the context that Job is speaking from here. Job is speaking from the context where the natural human inclination is to hope for that bad things will happen to your enemy. That's the context that Job is speaking from here. Verse 8. "For what is the hope of the godless when he is cut off, when God requires his life?" Now this is a rhetorical question. And the answer is, there is no hope. What is the hope of the godless when he's cut off? There is none. The word cut off means death. And so what's the hope of the godless when God cuts him off or God causes him to die? And the same thing requires his life when God causes him to die. Verse 9. "Will God hear the cry of the godless when distress comes upon him?" Again, this is a rhetorical question, and the answer is no. Verse 10. "Will the godless take delight in the Almighty? Will he call on God at all times?" Again, the answer is no. Verse 11. I will instruct you in the power of God. What is with the Almighty I will not conceal. Now again, this is Job speaking. The pronoun you is plural. Now, in English, we cannot differentiate between, when we see the pronoun you, we can't tell whether it's a plural you or a singular you in English. In biblical Hebrew, they could. And so we know that this particular pronoun here is plural, and it refers to his three friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. And basically, Job is saying that he's going to instruct his three friends about the power of God. Verse 12, behold, all of you have seen God's power. Why then do you act foolishly? Again, the pronoun you is plural. And let's look at the word foolishly here. As I said, throughout this dialogue, Job's friends tried to convince Job he was suffering because he had sinned, and Job kept disagreeing with them. Here, Job's basically saying that a lot of things that they've been telling him are foolishness, and he's asking them, he's pointing out to them that they have seen God's power, and then he's asking them why they're acting so foolishly when they have seen God's power. Verse 13. This is the portion of a wicked man from God, and the inheritance which tyrants receive from the Almighty. Now notice the word this. In this case, the word this is forward-looking. Oftentimes a pronoun or a word like this or these refers back. In this case, it looks forward. What Job is about to do is describe the bad things that happen to wicked people, or more specifically, the bad things that God does to wicked people. And that's what he's referring to by the word this. The things that he is about to say is the portion that a wicked man gets from God, or it's the inheritance which tyrants receive from the Almighty. Again, notice the repetition. Portion and inheritance is the same thing. Wicked men and tyrants are the same thing. And then you have from God and from the Almighty. These are two different ways of saying the same thing. Verse 14. Though the sons of the wicked are many, they are destined for the sword, and his descendants will not be satisfied with bread. Notice the word sword. So here Job said that the sons of the wicked, even though they're many, they're going to be killed by the sword, meaning they're not going to die a natural death. They're going to die in warfare, or they're going to die from murder. They're not going to die a natural death. Verse 15. The survivors of the wicked will be buried because of the plague, and the widows of the survivors will not be able to weep. And so we saw in the previous verses that a lot of the sons of the wicked would die by the sword, but the survivors, those who were not killed by the sword, were going to be killed by the plague. Again, they were going to die young and not live to old age, not die of old age. And then on top of that, the widows of those who died by the plague were not even going to be able to weep. And again, Job is describing here the bad things that happen to wicked people. Verse 16. Though the wicked piles up silver like dust and prepares garments as plentiful as the clay, the wicked may prepare a garment, but the just will wear the garment, and the innocent will divide the silver. The wicked has built his house like the spider's web, or as a hut which the watchman has made. Now, a spider's web is fragile. If you take your hand and wipe it through a spider's web, the spider's web is going to break very easily. Here Job basically said that when a wicked person builds a house, his house is every bit as fragile as a spider's web. Same thing as a hut. If a watchman is out somewhere keeping watch and they want to build a hut to provide some shelter, they're not going to build that hut to be long-lasting and permanent. Instead, they're just going to slap something together temporary, just long enough to give them some shelter. And so again, Job said that when the wicked person builds his house, it's going to be fragile or temporary, just like a hut which a watchman might make. Verse 19. The wicked lies down rich, but never again. He opens his eyes, and his wealth is no longer. Terrors overtake the wicked like a flood. A tempest steals him away in the night. The east wind carries the wicked away, and he is gone, for it whirls him away from his place. For the wind will hurl at the wicked without sparing. The wicked will surely try to flee from the power of the wind. Men will clap their hands at the wicked and will hiss the wicked from his place. Surely there is a mine for silver and a place where miners refine gold. Now, notice there's a change here. Up till now, Job's been talking about the bad things that happen to wicked people. Here suddenly he changes, and notice the word surely. In this verse, Job is simply establishing a fact. Silver exists, gold exists, and there's a place, a mine, where you get silver and gold. And so at this point, Job is simply establishing that fact which any of his friends would agree with. Verse 2. Verse 2. Iron is taken from the dust, and copper is smelted from rock. Man puts an end to darkness, and to the farthest limit he searches out the rock in gloom and deep shadow. Now, man searches out the rock. The rock, this refers to the rock that holds the gold and silver. And notice that this rock that holds gold and silver is in places that are gloomy and dark. And notice that man will travel to the farthest limit to search out this rock that holds gold and silver. And so Job is pointing out here that men will go to great lengths. Men will put forth a lot of effort to find gold and silver. And again, Job has a point for this, and he'll get to that. At this point, he's just trying to establish the fact that men will go to a lot of effort to find gold and silver. A man sinks a shaft far from habitation, forgotten by the foot. Miners hang and swing to and fro, far from men. Now notice a shaft. When men go out to look for gold and silver, they have to dig a shaft or dig a hole down into the ground to get to it. Notice this phrase, far from habitation. So the rock that holds gold and silver is oftentimes found way out in places that are far from where people live. And that's where these men go to sink the shaft to get to the gold and silver. This phrase, forgotten by the foot, means that the places where they go to mine gold and silver are so remote that humans don't normally walk in those places. And you have this concept of the miners hang and swing to and fro. When they sink a shaft, then the miners have to go down that shaft, and if they're going down on ropes, they're going to be swinging back and forth. And again, all of this is happening far from men. And again, Job is pointing out that men go to great lengths, that men put forth a lot of effort to go find gold and silver. Verse 5. The earth, from it comes food, and underneath it is turned up as fire. Now remember, I said earlier that Hebrew poetry is either repetition, addition, or contrast. This is an example of contrast. In this first phrase, Job mentions that the earth, from the earth comes food. So on the surface of the earth, we grow food. Underneath the earth, we don't grow food. Instead, down there's fire, there's a lot of rock. Verse 6. The rocks of the earth are the source of sapphires, and the dust of the earth contains gold. The path, now, notice the word path. The word path refers to the path to get to the gold and silver. And so the path to the gold and silver, no bird of prey knows, nor has the falcon's eye caught sight of it. The proud beasts have not trodden it, nor has the fierce lion passed over it. And so again, Job is pointing out that men go to great effort to get to gold and silver is so remote that birds don't go there, falcons can't see it, and even beasts and lions don't go there. Verse 9. A miner puts his hand on the flint. He overturns the mountains at the base. Notice the word overturns. Again, an illustration of the effort that men will put forth to find gold and silver. They'll even overturn mountains. Verse 10. A miner hews out channels through the rocks, and his eye sees anything precious. He dams up the streams from flowing, and what is hidden he brings out to the light. Again, men put forth a lot of effort to find gold and silver. But where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Notice the word but. Remember, I said earlier that Hebrew poetry is either repetition, addition, or contrast. This is another example of contrast. In the previous verses, Job mentioned, first of all, the effort that men go through to get gold and silver, But also part of that was to point out that gold and silver is something that you can hold in your hand. You can actually go out and physically find gold and silver and touch it and hold it. In contrast to that, where do you find wisdom? Where's the place of understanding? Where do you go to get wisdom? And again, this is a rhetorical question. Job's pointing out that you can't just go out and find wisdom. Wisdom is not something that you can hold and dig out of the ground. Verse 13, man does not know the value of wisdom, nor is wisdom found in the land of the living. The deep says, the word deep refers to the ocean. The ocean says, wisdom is not in me, and the sea says, wisdom is not with me. Pure gold cannot be given in exchange for wisdom, nor can silver be weighed as its price. Wisdom cannot be valued in the gold of Ophir, in precious onyx or sapphire. Gold or glass cannot equal wisdom, nor can wisdom be exchanged for articles of fine gold. So Job has been pointing out that you cannot go out and buy wisdom. And then here he points out that if you have wisdom, you can't sell wisdom in order to get fine gold. Verse 18, coral and crystal are not to be mentioned, and the acquisition of wisdom is above that of pearls. The value of coral and crystal are so far beneath the value of wisdom that coral and crystal should not even be mentioned if you're trying to determine or describe the value of wisdom. Verse 19, the topaz of Ethiopia cannot equal wisdom, nor can wisdom be valued in pure gold. Where then does wisdom come from? And where is the place of understanding? Now again, what Job has been saying here is that men go out and they mine gold and silver. And gold and silver is something you can hold. However, wisdom cannot be mined. You cannot go out somewhere on the earth and physically get wisdom. And he pointed out that wisdom can't be bought. And so he arrives at these questions. Where then do we get wisdom? Verse 21. Thus, wisdom is hidden from the eyes of all living and concealed from the birds of the sky. Abaddon and Death say, with our ears we have heard a report of wisdom. Now, Abaddon and Death are the same thing. Abaddon is just another term for death. But even death doesn't lead to wisdom, or even death doesn't understand wisdom. Verse 23. God understands the way to wisdom. God knows the place where wisdom is. For God looks to the ends of the earth and sees everything under the heavens. When God imparted weight to the wind and meted out the waters by measure, when God set a limit for the rain and a course for the thunderbolt. Now, notice the comma. This thought is going to continue. Notice the word when. Imparted weight to the wind, meted out the waters, set a limit for the rain. That's all a reference to when God created the earth. And so when God created the earth, then God saw wisdom and declared it. God established wisdom and searched it out. And so we see here that God's the one who created wisdom. 28. And to man God said, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So notice this first line here, God said to man, and notice the single quote here. So this is what God said to man, according to Job. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to depart from evil is understanding. So Job said that wisdom is not something we can go out and pick up. It's not something we can find. Instead, the fear of the Lord, that's how we be wise. So that raises the question, was Job correct? As I pointed out earlier, the author of Job is merely telling us what Job said. The author of Job is not necessarily telling us that Job was correct. And so we need to look at other verses to determine whether or not Job was correct. So let's look at Proverbs 9, verse 10. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the knowledge of the Holy One is understanding. Now in this case, the author of Proverbs is telling us this is what we should believe. This is what we should base our beliefs on. And it clearly says here, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Notice the word Lord is in all capital letters. And the Hebrew word that was used there is Yahweh, which is God's personal name. And so the fear of Yahweh is the beginning of wisdom. Notice the word beginning. The author of Proverbs said that if you want to be wise, the starting point is to fear Yahweh. You fear Yahweh, that's where you start in order to become wise. And so again, we see Job was correct, that the fear of the Lord is wisdom. Let's look also Proverbs 15:33. The fear of the Lord is the instruction for wisdom, and before honor comes humility. Notice the word instruction. So if we want to go instruct someone how to be wise or teach someone how to be wise, what we need to teach is the fear of Yahweh, because that's the instruction, that's the beginning point for wisdom. Now this leads to the question why or how. Why does the fear of Yahweh lead to wisdom, or how does the fear of Yahweh lead to wisdom? Let's look at Matthew 10:28. And this is Jesus speaking, and he said, "Do not fear those who kill the body but are unable to kill the soul, but rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell." The word "those" refers to humans. So Jesus says, do not fear humans, because yes, they can kill the body, but humans can't do anything to the soul. And as humans, we often fear other humans if we're in a dangerous situation. And that's true, there are humans we should be afraid of because there are bad humans who want to kill other people. But Jesus said, don't fear them, rather fear him. The word him refers to God. Fear God because God is able to destroy not only the body, but also the soul. And God has the power to send people to hell. And so he's the one that we should fear more so than humans who are only able to kill the body. Let me illustrate it this way. Think of a hurricane. I want you to imagine that you live on the coast and you hear that a hurricane, a very strong hurricane, is coming right towards your house. What are you going to do? Well, you're going to be afraid, and you're going to board up your house, and you're going to flee inland. You're going to get away from the storm. You're going to get out of its way. Why? Because you're afraid. The reason you're afraid is because that hurricane has the power to kill you. And so it is wise to fear hurricanes and get out of the way because they're capable of killing people. Likewise with a car. Imagine there's a car coming right at you at 50 miles an hour. What are you going to do? You're going to get out of the way. You're going to yield to the car because you're afraid, and you're afraid of the car because the car has the power to kill you. And so a wise person gets out of the way of a speeding car because it's capable of killing you. Likewise with a tiger. A tiger is capable of killing humans. And so if you see a tiger and there's nothing between you and the tiger, you're going to be afraid because you know the tiger can kill you, and you're going to do something to get out of the way of the tiger, get away from the tiger, or yield to the tiger. And so likewise with Yahweh. Yahweh is the one who determines what happens to us after we die. And so just like we should be afraid of hurricanes and tigers and cars that can kill us, so too Yahweh is capable of killing us, and Yahweh is the one who determines what happens to us when we die. And so we should be afraid of that, and we should yield to Yahweh. When Yahweh tells us to do certain things, we should yield and obey him because he determines what happens to us after we die. And so just as it is wise to fear hurricanes and tigers and cars because they're capable of killing us and we yield to them and get out of the way, likewise with Yahweh, it is wise to fear Yahweh because Yahweh has the power to determine what happens to us after we die, and we should yield to Yahweh and obey him. If you'd like to receive the next episode of Bible Mountain via email, please visit www.biblemountain.com, click on follow, and there will be a place to enter your email address and subscribe to my email feed. This is a free subscription, and your email will not be sold nor given away. Also, if you like this video, please use the share buttons on your webpage to like it and or share it with your friends. And once again, thank you for watching BibleMountain.com.